It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Well, good morning. Hello. Hi. How are you? And welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, there, I got it up right away. And I always like to have that to show people what the big three is on the PBG, Podcast by George. I mean, we start at the top end of the funnel here. It's climate. That's the number one issue that we discuss, and then closely aligned to that because everything is interwoven and interconnected. War in healthcare. But as the great Lee Camp said when he was on my show, folks, we have got to address climate. It has to be the first thing that we talk about. It has to be the last thing that we talk about. As Lee said, every Chinese fortune cookie that we get should start and end with climate change. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, the environment and climate change and green energy in particular. And joining us on the Podcast by George live line, again, an old friend, somebody that hasn't been on for quite a while. I think the last time she was on, we were still doing audio. It's Carrie Johansson, and she's with the Energy Program Director. She's the Energy Program Director with the Iowa Environmental Council. She has over a decade of experience in energy policy, most recently serving as the Council's Manager of Government Affairs, leading state-level legislative strategy. God, somebody's got to do it. I'm glad that she is. She previously developed energy policy with the U.S. Senate Agriculture Committee, administered the Iowa Power Fund for innovative clean energy projects, and worked as an analyst and legislative liaison with the Iowa Utilities Board before joining the council in 2016. Johansson has a BA from Gustavus Adolphus College. I think they got a hockey team up there. And a master's in public policy from the Humphrey Institute at the University of Minnesota. So let's take that down and see if we can get our guest to join us here this morning. And just delighted to have her back. Bingo. There she is, the magic of the internet. Good morning, Carrie.
Good morning, George. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, thanks for coming back on. And I want you to kind of clarify a little bit because there seems to be some good news afoot. But I was reading into an article recently in the Des Moines Register, and you were quoted in it. And it was kind of like, yeah, this is good news, but be careful. I mean, tread carefully here. And I'm going to bring this up on screen to kind of let people know what I'm talking about here. So this was the article in the Des Moines Register. MidAmerican, I mean, the big energy provider across much of Iowa, but certainly here in the central part of the state, proposes adding enough wind solar generation to meet all of Iowa customers' power needs. And Danielle Eller, the excellent writer with the Des Moines Register, authored this article. I saw that and I thought, wow, this is great. It reads, MidAmerican Energy said Wednesday that it's seeking to invest $3.9 billion to develop more wind and solar energy and explore new technologies that will push the company closer to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. That's the Des Moines-based utility generated nearly 88% of the power used by its Iowa customers from renewable sources in 2021. In a filing with the Iowa Utilities Board, it proposes building 2,042 megawatts of wind and 50 megawatts of solar generation. I'm not a megawatt guy. We'll have to have Carrie clarify that a little bit. But the filing said the projects would push MidAmerican's wind generation to 9,300 megawatts and solar capacity to nearly 200 megawatts. In a statement, it said the wind initiative alone would enable it to provide enough renewable energy that's equal to its Iowa customers' annual usage. Oh, really? The company owned by Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett, also proposes studying emerging technologies, including energy storage, the use of small modular nuclear reactors. We got to talk about that a little bit because I've been hearing something about modular, smaller nuclear reactors and employing carbon capture to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from its remaining coal fire plants. Okay, and then we're going to talk a little bit about these carbon capture pipelines, but let's get rid of this. We'll go back to that, bring Carrie back in here. And Carrie, like I said, this sounds all good. It sounds great, as a matter of fact, But you had a word of caution quoted a little bit later in this article.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, MidAmerican has been saying for a while, they've put out this supposed 100% renewable vision, and they talk a lot about providing clean energy to their Iowa customers. And although that they may be generating enough actual electricity to do that, they're still running 6 coal-fired power plants in the state, almost 4,000 megawatts of coal generation. And they don't talk about that. So the idea that, they're going to continue to expand their renewable generation without closing down any coal-fired power plants is really not, it's not a real renewable energy goal. And no place in their announcement did they talk at all about actually closing down any of these coal-fired power plants. And that's important for a couple of reasons, not just because keeping them online, they run them, they sell the power to other states. All of the coal-fired generation in 2020, for example, none of it was needed to actually serve Iowa customers. They sold it out of state to make profits for Berkshire Hathaway, while the pollution and the cost fall on Iowa customers. So while these plants are still running and operating, we're paying for them. The pollution is still affecting people here in Iowa. And that's not right. And that's not a real 100% renewable energy vision.
So that's the good news, bad news part about that. I wondered about that because I'm reading this thinking, well, this is great, but they're not talking about replacing fossil fuel generated energy here in the state of Iowa. They're talking about adding on, and then that potentially could be sold. And that's always remarkable to me that they can export basically energy. And we've got these grid issues that are holding back wind and solar, but there's no problem using that grid to create excess generating capacity, as an example, and exporting that and keeping these dirty plants online.
That's right. We do. We have transmission constraint issues that limit the deployment of renewables to the extent that they could be. And part of shutting down generation as well is opening up generation or capacity on the transmission system too. So while these coal plants continue to take up transmission capacity, that's also capacity that could be shifted to renewables. In addition, one of the things that I talked about in the article is the cost of continuing to run these plants. This is something that's happening across the country as the cost of renewables drop and the cost of continuing to run coal plants rise. So in many cases, the cost of just running a coal plant is more expensive than building and running renewable energy. And for MidAmerican, for example, running their remaining plants is actually costing customers money. If they close down all of their plants by 2030 and replace them with renewable energy, it would save Iowa customers between $1.2 and $5 billion.
Wow.
So it's not just about green energy. It's like dollars and cents on your electric bill that MidAmerican is spending.
Well, MidAmerican, I see their commercials all the time. They'll tell you about how creative they are, how innovative they are, how much they care about you and I. And I read an article like this and I think, well, you got to start somewhere. I'm not an incrementalist, Carrie, but I look at this and think, okay, this is a beginning. Do they have the ability to start here and then to expand to where they could do exactly what you're talking about, where they could be a completely green energy company? Or from what you're seeing now, particularly with legislation and as close to these issues as you are, do they really have no intention to do that in your mind?
I think that they will do what their customers demand that they do, and they will do what the government tells them they have to do. And so I do think they are capable of transitioning to be a 100% green energy company. I think the grid and the regional market enables that as well. I don't think that there are barriers to them retiring their coal plants by 2030. I think it's about dollars and cents for them. It's about their shareholders. I absolutely think that they are creative and innovative enough to get this done.
Well, God, let's hope so. Let me bring this article back up on screen because it's got some other elements in it that I wanted to get Carrie's expert analysis and perspective on. So let's see if I can bring this up. Okay. This has to do with these carbon capture pipelines, Carrie. This article reads on to say 3 companies are proposing to build pipelines across Iowa that would capture carbon dioxide at Iowa ethanol and fertilizer plants, use pressure to liquefy it, then sequester it deep underground at locations in North Dakota and Illinois. And I read that and what the hell? That sounds kind of nutty. But I had Emma Schmidt on from Food and Water Watch, and she explained that they're wanting to export this to those states because there are some oil fields that are about used up in those states. And if they inject that stuff into the ground up there, and they're telling us it's safe and sequestered and all that, but really what they're going to do is shoot it into the ground and get the last drop of oil from these exhausted fields that they possibly can. That was all new to me. MidAmerica said Wednesday, this was after a query from the Register, I think, that it must investigate whether carbon capture is technically and economically feasible before it can consider using it. Interesting. So if the company's wind prime plan is approved, it plans to complete construction by late 2024. Okay, Carrie. So what I know kind of what that's telling us, but why is that important as far as this plan's concerned?
I mean, it's definitely all potentially connected. There's not a direct connection there being drawn between the carbon pipelines necessarily and the coal plants, but certainly you can see how these pipelines might improve the economics of sequestering carbon from a coal plant. At the same time, we have not seen a successful carbon sequestration project at a coal plant to this point. It's extraordinarily expensive, certainly more expensive than wind and solar and battery combo generation. And it's also, carbon sequestration is a technology that the IPCC was pretty clear in its most recent report is needed to meet a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target. Now, with that said, there are certain applications, certain areas that are very hard to decarbonize, some industrial processes, et cetera, where carbon sequestration might be a viable option. There are really ultimately what we need to be doing is pulling carbon dioxide from the air and sequestering it. So taking something that's easy to decarbonize, like electricity, and applying applying a speculative technology to that hasn't been in that application before, that's really expensive, makes no sense to me from where we sit right now. We know we could save money by closing down the coal and replacing it with wind and solar. So why would we push out this deadline with this expensive speculative technology at this point in time? It looks like a delay tactic to me.
I did a podcast earlier just on the pipelines with Emma Schmidt, as a matter of fact, and I put up a graphic. I don't have it to put up today, but I would encourage people to give that a look. I called it a Rube Goldberg plan. Carrie knows how to use words, obviously. I mean, that's her job, and she has to be able to do that to get things done. Calling that speculative technology is a great way to put that. I mean, because you'll talk to people that just flatly will tell you it will not work. It does not work. It's never worked. It's just a boondoggle plan to make money for some very few billionaires, basically, and it'll probably be used for something else at some point in the future, but probably won't work at all. Well, let's continue with this. I want to bring this back in here so that we can continue on with it. And then here's this more part of it. Iowa, a leader in wind energy, will see a burst of solar development in coming months, but opposition is emerging. And so it goes on to show this and talks about the fact that there, a lot of people, $14 billion in renewable energy since 2004 that MidAmerican's invested in. But as wind farms have grown across the state, they have attracted lawsuits and moratoriums over noise, health concerns, and visual blight. And I read that, Carrie, and I'm like, oh my God. I mean, really? If you consider the CAFOs and the health concerns and the blight and the smell concerned with that, that's all across Iowa, and those move forward, those get approved, they're popping up all over the place. And yet there are people that are opposed to solar panels because they're a visual blight. And I read that and I like, compared to what? The growing number of solar projects also has started to spark opposition with rural residents concerned about loss of Iowa farmland, and especially for young farmers, the rapidly rising cost of the land that remains. And of course, there's a lot of key things just in that one sentence. The reason that there's very little land remaining is because it's all been bought up by any that's available anyway, by major Iowa corporations. It's all under tillage. Most farmers, particularly these big ones that we're talking about, the corporations, my God, they've seen an increase in wealth that's really unprecedented. It's one of the biggest growth sectors in the nation's economy. And they're complaining about this compromising their ability to make more money. In 2021, utilities proposed solar projects that were expected to consume thousands of acres. And of course, we're thousands of acres, but we're talking about a state that has millions and hundreds of millions of acres of farmland. So I don't know, anything more to add to that, Carrie?
Yeah, I mean, I think that renewable energy is being used sort of as the arguments, especially, I can address a little bit of the solar issue.
Yeah.
We've done some analysis on what it would take to get Iowa to 100% renewable energy. It would take less than 1% of the total land in the state. And so, we're talking about just a tiny amount of land to get us all the way there. In terms of wind, yeah, we have seen some counties and places where people have gotten up in arms about wind projects. I think you're going to see a wide variation, though, from one place to another in terms of acceptance of wind. It's brought, tens of millions of dollars in tax revenue to counties. They've done all kinds of, great road and infrastructure, senior meal sites. It funds healthcare and schools in places where revenues are needed for those services that people still really need. And so, some counties, you'll still find a lot of acceptance for wind, and other places you won't. And I think that's one reason why we talk about the need to balance the interests of the people who have wind turbines with the people who don't. It's just common sense to have some reasonable regulations on setbacks and things like that don't kill projects, but that respect neighbors. So we think that balance is eminently doable. And we encourage counties to take on that conversation with their residents. And it's been done successfully all over Iowa. On the solar front, like I said, it is a very small percentage of overall farmland. I also really don't like the language of it consuming farmland.
Yeah.
Really, if we think about urban sprawl and how much farmland is consumed every year, it's a far larger proportion every year than we would need total to get to 100% renewable energy. And a lot of that is prime farmland that you will never return to tillage. When you're talking about a solar project, you're giving the land a rest for 30 years, and then it can go back into production if that's what the landowner chooses to do with it. You can do pollinator habitat, you can do wildlife-friendly fencing, you can do agricultural, you can do grazing of certain kinds of animals on land. There's a lot of research being done into what they call agrivoltaics, where you can have these dual use purposes in an agricultural setting like we have here. It's not one or the other. And certainly the benefits of all of this have been downplayed to a large extent when we just highlight the controversy and some of the opposition.
Yeah, Carrie talks about the the urban sprawl on farmland as an example. Well, what was it before it was farmland? If you're looking in your backyard and you're seeing deer, think about that. I mean, and if you're looking out your back door at night and you're seeing a mountain lion, you might think about that also. There were other uses for this land and other inhabitants before we got here, folks. And on this issue of people that are objecting to these wind and solar farms, I got to bring this up. I mean, this is what it always reminds me of. Now, I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. I'm a lot older than Carrie is, but I mean, I'm sure that she can identify with this. This is that scene out of Star Trek. I don't know, The Search for Spock, one of the movies anyway. But the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. I mean, old Spock was going to die there for the crew of the Starship Enterprise, going in there to, I don't know, deactivate that reactor or whatever the case might be. But even that every word means something. I mean, it's very key here. We're talking about the needs of the few and the needs of the many. We're talking about needs. We're not talking about wants. We're not talking about desires. We're not talking about esoterics. And we're certainly not talking about money here. We're talking about needs. We're talking about the top of the funnel that I started off discussing here on this edition of Podcast by George. Folks, if we don't address these things, it's game over. We have got to start there, and we've got to begin addressing these needs for the many as opposed to the needs of the few, like the Berkshire Hathaway investors that Carrie was talking about. And I want to see what I've got here to continue on to this article. Now, this is where Carrie is quoted. The Iowa Environmental Council's Energy Program Director, Carrie Johansson, said the group welcomes MidAmerica's aggressive deployment of renewables. On the whole, however, we continue to question any discussion of MidAmerica's 100% clean energy plan when this announcement does not mention any reduction in fossil fuel generation. Okay, so we talked about that earlier. This is adding on. This is not replacing necessarily. Johansson said the group wants to see more details about how MidAmerican will address affordability when looking at new technologies. Zero carbon is the bar that must be met, she said. But it's important to keep in mind that customers ultimately pay for all of this. And this has to do with, oh, God, I mean, I talk all the time about these privately owned or, publicly traded groups like Berkshire Hathaway as an example. What people don't understand is they're prohibited by charter. I mean, their very foundation, their very fundamental is to return money, to generate capital for the investors. It is not to save the world. It is not to benefit us. And Carrie knows that all too well. I mean, you've got to look at these groups this way and analyze these announcements in that light. Carrie?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why incentives work. That's why tax credits are an important part of getting people to do the right thing. That's why regulations are necessary, because they're not out to save the world. They're doing what makes sense for their bottom line. And like you're saying, that's what they're required to do. However, they're also a monopoly regulated entity in Iowa. We don't have a choice for where we get our electricity. So MidAmerican and Alliant Energy are both fully regulated for their rates, customer service, all of that by the Iowa Utilities Board. And they're supposed to provide a balance to take into account what's good for customers and not just what's good for the bottom line of the company. And so that's why it's really important that the Utilities Board understands what customers are after from MidAmerican, and that they look at this cost information and say, is MidAmerican really doing what's in the best interest of customers, or have they overbalanced as we really think that they have, and are really just acting in the best interest of their shareholders at this point?
And Warren Buffett, the owner of Berkshire Hathaway, he's oftentimes quoted as saying, God, we need to tax the rich more. We need to get more money from them. We need to, as a country, get these people to start paying their fair share. Well, that sounds great. But this would be an excellent opportunity to do it, I think. Let's not put this all on the shoulders of taxpayers, particularly here in the state of Iowa. Let's put some of it back on MidAmerica, because, folks, they got more money than the Pharaoh. I mean, I don't know how you could ever spend the amount of money that these companies have. Carrie, I want to bring this back up on screen because this is an when I got this film clip, this was interesting to me. Now, this is a spinning wind turbine, but it's right next to one of these overhead power line towers, whatever you want to call it. What's the history on that? I mean, people are opposed to these turbines as an example, and you see what that looks like. But they allow these power line towers on their property, and they've been there for a long time, and they're dangerous, and they kill birds, and so on and so on. Is that a part of the consideration set?
So it's kind of complicated, but
Maybe we don't have that much
transmission,
time.
yeah, I definitely, yeah, I mean, you're going to see controversy with any large infrastructure project that impacts a lot of people, and definitely transmission line projects have not been without controversy. Transmission lines are something that serve a lot of people. They are, sort of in the public interest is one of the findings that the Utilities Board has to make. And so transmission lines, they do have access to eminent domain when they build transmission. And so, like I said, it's not without controversy. You mentioned before, like the needs of the many and the needs of the few, and large infrastructure is one of those places where you have to try to balance that out when you're trying to deliver power to people. And so, and definitely, there are things you have to work around with large transmission lines, et cetera. But they're, yeah, like you said, they get them built. It's really hard to build in a new corridor. A lot of transmission lines, what they'll do is build build them larger in an existing corridor, so they don't have to try to get new land. You may have heard of the Sioux Green Line project that's being discussed. That would be a completely underground, large scale transmission line. So people are experimenting with different ideas for how to build transmission. It's also really important. We talk a lot about microgrids and, taking more responsibility for shoring up the other kind of nerdy behind the scenes infrastructure that doesn't get as much conversation or talk, but is just as important, in making sure we all have the energy we need to keep us safe and supplied with all of the things that we need.
Well, I want to say that we're trying to get, very concise answers from Carrie on some very broad, big issues that we could spend all day talking about. But you mentioned infrastructure in this example. And this infrastructure bill has been approved by the federal government. And what hasn't been approved now is this Build Back Better bill. And one of the key things in that is about $500 billion devoted to the development of green energy solutions and climate change. How important is that, Carrie? How critical is the passage of that bill, which is really kind of dead in the water right now, the BBB, the Build Back Better bill?
Yeah, I mean, we were very excited to see what was included in that bill. It would really, it would make a huge push forward to accelerate adoption that we need at the rate that we need to really take on climate change. Business as usual, things are changing, they're happening, but at this pace, it's just not going to cut it. And anyone who pays attention to climate knows that. And so the amount of investment and the kinds of policies that were included in that bill are really fundamental to jumpstarting the transition in the U.S. And I know that it's our economy, our environmental justice concerns, who pays and who benefits from energy supply right now, like that's all very much tied into this. And so it is really unfortunate that the Build Back Better Act, kind of stalled out the way it did. I still very much hope that maybe some of these climate incentives can be revived, but there's so much in there that is really fundamental to continuing to have like a sustainable society as a whole. And so we'll see what happens, but I still hope that we can at least get those climate incentives through.
Well, I consider myself to be a progressive, maybe even left of what a lot of people consider to be progressives. And I was disgusted and shocked and dismayed. You can put any adjective on that you want to when the House decoupled those two bills, that infrastructure bill, which passed, which by and large benefits the larger corporations and businesses that are supported by the Republicans. And the progressives said, well, we'll just send it over to the Senate, and they'll do the right things. We trust the system and the process, and we think that we'll get that Build Back Better bill. And of course, they didn't. The other part that kind of disgusted me about it was that it includes not only the $500 billion that I mentioned for climate change, but there's $400 billion in there for universal pre-K, $200 billion for child tax credits, $200 billion for 4 weeks of paid leave. And then also they want to beef up IRS enforcement of tax evaders. Now, you want to strike fear and panic and dread in the hearts of Republicans. Those things that I just mentioned, that'll do it, folks. I mean, that has a lot to do with why that's sitting there, as I mentioned, dead in the water. Also, why it's about a third, maybe a half to a third of what it was originally proposed to be. And it may not go anywhere unless they can tear it apart, kind of what Kerry was talking about. And maybe let's just do the climate change thing, the top of the funnel that I'm talking about, because actually Republicans and Democrats alike, Democrats obviously, but also some Republicans are actually for some mitigation of the climate crisis, climate catastrophe. No Republicans are for these other things, beefing up IRS enforcement of tax evaders, $200 billion for 4 weeks of paid leave. That's not going to walk. I mean, I think that's got something to do with what's happening. So it's just a mess, but I certainly hope that it can get resolved, because we need to move, and we need to move quickly, because as podcast by George says all the time, Kerry, we're living in a 2020 world. That's how I'm looking at things. We've got 20 years to get this resolved as far as climate is concerned, or it's game over. And it could be 20 minutes if we don't do something about these nuclear weapons and this saber rattling and warmongering that's got the world on the edge of disaster. Kerry, it's just great to have you back on the show again. It's been a long time. I'm going to wrap it up here and kind of give you a close, put a bow on it. Anything here that you'd want to say as we wrap up, or people contacting you or the group or the organization, or what's ahead? Anything you want to say?
Yeah, I would definitely, encourage people to check out the Iowa Environmental Council website at iaenvironment.org. And sign up for our newsletters and action alerts. We have an energy-specific newsletter that goes out monthly with lots of good information in it. We also keep people apprised of what's going on at the Iowa legislature, and you'll learn more about how to get involved at the Iowa Utilities Board, and making sure that they're doing what they need to do to hold MidAmerican accountable. And just, this is the moment. George said it earlier, starting and ending every fortune cookie with climate. And, as a mom who, like so many others, are also living, through this pandemic with children and climate and everything else, we see the way that this impacts our kids now. And every day. And it helps me, get up and keep coming into my home office every morning to talk about this. And I hope, I hope that we all feel like, together, if we all are saying enough is enough, we can make the difference that needs to be made to get where we need to be on this. So thank you so much for having me on.
That's great. I mean, that's well said, because that's really what it's all about. It's about these kids. It's about these grandkids. It's not me, folks. I'm going to make it through. It's about over for me anyway. I mean, I ain't going to live forever. I told somebody the other day, I'm going to put on the back of my tombstone, I'm going to put enjoy the heat. I mean, because it'll still be going on when I'm gone. But if we're concerned about our kids and our grandkids the way that everybody professes to be, we've got to address the climate, and we've got to do it now. Kerry Johansson, Energy Program Director with the Iowa Environmental Council. Thanks again for coming on this edition of Podcast by George. All right, folks, that's it. We've got a little internet issue here as we wrap up, but I'm going to go back to the solo view here just for me and I kind of with my little close here. Now, this is how I always end the episodes. I encourage everybody to go to podcastbygeorge.com. Pick a platform. Pick a place that you would like to see, that you would like to listen to Podcast by George. Click on that icon, subscribe, follow, like on Stitcher, the iHeartRadio app, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, Facebook, all of those places, and you'll get each and every episode, and you'll get these excellent perspectives and expert analysis from people like Carrie Johansson. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.